What's up everybody, this is Josh and I'm here to bring you guys my top 32 deck profile for YCS Bologna. Couldn't quite make it all the way for the back-to-back from last year, but I'm still very happy with how I did. Before we go into the list, I want to give a huge shout out to my new team, Team Raid and Trade. This list was a group effort. A lot of people contributed to it. A lot of people played the deck in the event and did very well with it. Nico went 12-0 with it in Swiss and was my only loss in Swiss as well. And some other people obviously made day 2 with it and made top 64. Let's get into what we played. The entire idea of Fiendsmith Kashtira was that we thought that hand traps were really good in this format and we were looking for the best grindy one-card engines to work with it. And so the Fiendsmith cards came to mind because they give you infinite grind game, they play very well into hand traps, and they produce some very efficient end boards that you can pair with hand traps to be super solid. And the Kashtira cards is just that little bit extra on top that helps you break some half boards, lets you establish more disruptions going first, and also lets you bridge into the Fiendsmith engine if you don't have access to it by hard drawing it. So the deck literally just has like 3 pillars: Fiendsmith cards, Kashtira cards, and hand traps. You can already tell by the size of the thing that there's quite a substantial amount of hand traps. This deck is 42 cards. There is a particular reason for it, but we were toying around with the ratios a lot. The beauty about this deck was that you could really adjust the ratios as you like. You can slightly increase the Kashtira cards if you want to see more Kashtira cards. You can slightly increase the Fiendsmith cards if you want to see more Fiendsmith cards. You can even slightly increase the number of hand traps or decrease the number of hand traps. And so we were messing around with a whole lot of different ratios. This is what we ended up with because this is where we felt like the ratio between drawing Fiendsmith cards, Kashtira cards, and hand traps was just right. For the Fiendsmith package, it is 3 Fiendsmith engraver, obviously. And then also, not so standard, but we played 3 Lacrima. The beauty of Lacrima in this deck is that it's by far the best normal summon, and it's almost impossible to interrupt Lacrima in hand trap wars. You can stop Lacrima from setting up a Caesar or something with a hand trap, but it's really, really hard to stop Lacrima from completely giving you follow-up and access to the trap card, which I'll show in a moment. Because you normal summon this thing, it'll send an engraver on summon, so like if you Imperm or Veiler that, you still make Requiem with it, that'll still give you access to engraver. So in order to stop this from accessing engraver, you already have to negate it twice. Even then, it'll still have this and Requiem in the graveyard for follow-up on future turns. Then there's 2 track and the Lurry. The second track is here because we wanted an extra Fiendsmith card, and also we didn't want to run out of search targets for engraver to search in case we drew the 1 track. And then there is 1 copy of Fiendsmith in Paradise. I think this card is something that a lot of people were very surprised by. This card has a very fancy effect on the board, but you almost never use that one. I used it once the entire tournament. I mean, if you can set it up with a Desiree, it is very, very strong, but it is mainly here for the graveyard effect. So the goal for this deck, no matter if you get hand trapped or not, but usually even through hand traps, this is super, super easy, is you just want to have a Lacrima in the graveyard and a Requiem in the graveyard. The other things you produce with your Fiendsmith engine is basically up to you and how you get hand trapped, but if these 2 are in the graveyard, what you can do on the opponent's turn is you use Lacrima's effect, shuffle itself back into the deck, bring the Requiem back out, use the Requiem's effect on the opponent's turn to summon out the Lacrima, and send Fiendsmith in Paradise from the deck to the graveyard. And now this graveyard effect says when your opponent special summons, you banish it to send the Fiendsmith from deck or extract to the graveyard, and so you send Desiree. And Desiree will trigger to send the card from the opponent to the graveyard. So that way you can interrupt your opponent. Even if they hand trap your Lacrima or your Fiendsmith engine to death, it will still produce at least 1 interrupt, and that is super, super crucial in hand trap wars, that this engine produces interruptions even if it gets hand trapped itself. So that's the beauty of the Fiendsmith cards. These cards give you infinite grind game. Once you have access to the Fiendsmith engine, you'll have extra pushes every single turn, and this is how this deck wins the hand trap wars, on top of just applying some extra pressure with the Kashtiras. 3 Fenrirs, 2 Unicorns, 1 Birth, and 3 Planets. We did have 3 Unicorns in there at some point. We did have Terraforming in there at some point, but we decided to slightly adjust the ratios because we didn't want to see multiple Kashtira cards too often. Like, the perfect ratio is basically 1 Kashtira card, 1 Fiendsmith card, the rest non-engine. That is the dream, but there's like ways how you can deal with drawing 2 of these. Like, for example, if you draw Fenrir Unicorn, you know, Unicorn can get you Birth, and then you could normal the Fenrir and stuff like that. But these cards just give you resilience to hand traps, extra bodies to go into Moon, into the Fiendsmith cards, pressure, and extra disruptions. This is basically what makes your end board good enough and very hard to break basically all the time. And they give you a lot of grind game and follow-up as well. And the rest of the main deck is literally 23 hand traps. 3 Ash Blossom, 3 Ghost Ogre, 3 Mourner, 3 Veiler, 3 Imp, Imperm, and 3 Dominus Purge. Those are the really good ones that we play 3 copies of. Dominus Purge almost does not bother you in this deck at all. The only thing you have to be worried about, like if you have Ash and Purge, you have to Ash first because Purge locks you out of Ash. All the other hand traps and your engines don't really care about it at all. There's like 1 or 2 extra deck monsters, or 3 I think, that you have to be aware of, that you can't use them after Purge, but that's it. The card is just another great addition to the hand traps that this deck can already play. Since that was not enough for us, we decided to play some other more situational hand traps as 2-ofs, which was Bell, which has a lot of like niche applications in this format. Negating Wanted is really good. Sometimes you negate Promethean Princess, Flamberge, a lot of random stuff. I negated like SP that tried to banish my follow-up from the graveyard. Lots of little stuff that is really good when this card is like your 3rd hand trap in hand. It can come in handy. 2 Nibiru's. This card is very good in this deck because you can pair it with hand traps really well, and it is especially impossible to push through this when you go first. When you have like Fenrir or access to some Fiendsmith combos, they try to play into it, you nip them afterwards, and you have follow-up because you have like Birth on the board and Fiendsmith in the graveyard. Very, very good card. The reason why it's not a 3-of is it's not great against Tenpai, and that deck's very popular, and it can sometimes clash with the Kashtira cards. Very often, if you draw Nib going second, you will either have to draw like the Fiendsmith engine directly, or you will normal summon a hand trap, but it is not optimal with the Kashtira, so we kind of wanted to minimize the hands where we draw like Nib with like 1 or 2 Kashtira cards going second. But the card overall is still good enough for us to still wanting to play it. And the last card, and this is going to seem very random, is I main decked 1 Perulia. Most of us in the team did this, I think, but the reason I did this one is just because we had major struggles with the side deck space, and we wanted a lot of stuff for going first. We wanted the Molcharmies in our deck somewhere, and adding this 1 Perulia to the main deck made our side deck patterns so much easier. And the idea was that if you ever go second, which it should be about 50% of the time, in case you're wondering, this deck still chooses first because all these cards turn into interruptions when you start, and it's also in a game where you're trading hand traps with your opponent, you want to start forcing out their hand traps first, usually, because your Fiendsmith cards and your Kashtira cards trade favorably into their hand traps. So this deck still chooses first, otherwise we'd be playing more Molcharmies. But basically, if you ever go first and you open Molcharmy, it is only bad if you also draw Lacrima pretty much, otherwise you can just normal summon it. Special summon Unicorn, normal summon Perulia, make Moon is a completely valid play. Whenever you go second, this is just a good card to have in your deck. If it helps you with your side deck patterns, it basically means that your deck is much better every game 2 and 3 if you have this card in your main deck, because it like lets you put more specific cards into your side decks. So that's it. The deck is 42 cards. Like I said, throughout all the testing we've done over weeks, it's just what felt right. You know, we had 40 card versions of the deck where it was like 20 hand traps, so like half of it was hand traps, and we felt like we wanted a little bit more, so we went a little higher on deck count because we also really didn't want to cut any of the Fiendsmith cards. And then at some point I just said, you know what, I think I'm just going to play slightly over 40 because I also don't want to see Fiendsmith and Paradise too much in my hand, and sometimes Kashtira Birth, right? Everything else in this deck is basically just pure gas, like either non-engine or really strong engine cards. Minimizing the chances of drawing the Paradise and the Birth I think was worth it because we were adding just like good cards into the mix, right? Like Perulia, Nib, and Bell, even though they're not always good as the other ones, they're still very, very strong, especially when they're paired with the other hand traps. For the extra deck, I decided to play 2 Desirees. For some of us, this was an IP Masquerena instead. I played 2 Desirees because I really wanted to be able to summon a Desiree and then still have these set up for the trap card in the graveyard, because otherwise, if you only play 1 and you set up Desiree with the trap in the graveyard, you don't have another Desiree to send, and I really wanted to be able to do that. And also in some grind games, this came up very handy. Like my opponent would out a Desiree and I was able to like make a sequence and still make another Desiree, so that was relevant. There's a Necroquip Princess. This card is amazing in this deck because you play so many hand traps. Sometimes if you get interrupted, you can literally just end on like Fenrir plus Necroquip and then draw extra cards whenever you hand trap. It also makes drawing multiple Fiendsmith cards super good because whenever you have 2 Fiendsmith cards including Engraver, what you do is you use your first Fiendsmith card to start your stuff and make the Necroquip, and then you use the Engraver for track and draw an extra card. So in this case, the Engraver just replaces itself and will most likely draw you into more non-engine because that is what most of your deck is. Then there's 2 Requiems, super important for follow-up and all that kind of stuff. 1 Sequence, I would have loved to play 2 because this would have made this deck so much better into other Kashtira unicorns. It was definitely my 16th card that I would have played. I'm not sure what I would have cut because the extra deck is really tight because this deck is like meant to be super grindy and versatile in all kinds of simplified game states. There's a lot of like utility in here that we didn't want to sacrifice for a second sequence. I didn't lose a game because I didn't have it, but I think ideally you would like to play 2 Sequence. The Agnum Day is honestly really good in a pure Fiendsmith deck because this helps this deck end games super fast. Like if you can stop your opponents for 1 to 2 turns, it is usually very easy to win the game with Agnum Day. What this card does is you quick effect, you choose a Fiendsmith fusion in your graveyard, you resummon it, and this equips itself to it, and it gives the fusion monster that it's equipped to the effect that it gains attack equal to the link rating of the link monsters equipped to it times 600. So basically when this is equipped to a Desiree, the Desiree is 4600. So what you do is you attack for 18, quick effect, basically tag out into the Desiree, and then this can still attack. This alone is 6400 damage. So next to an Engraver, a Necrocrypt, or any Kashtira monster, this is game. And that is like super common, right? Like you stop your opponent, you have a Fenrir or Unicorn, you go Fiendsmith combo next to it, you go sequence, make Desiree, link them off into Agnum Day, send their monster with Desiree, battle phase, attack, equip, and that's the end of the game, right? Really efficient card. It can come up in some turn 1 combos as well that we found, where you make it on turn 1, you bring back Engraver with it, then you make Caesar with the Engraver, then this is in your graveyard, you bring it back on your opponent's turn with Lacrima to revive the Desiree, so you have Caesar plus Desiree, but it's mainly here for ending games quickly. Moon, so you can pivot Kashtira cards or hand traps into the Fiendsmith engine. I literally won games where I drew only hand traps and nothing else. I played against Fire King one game, I let them summon from the extra deck twice, then on my turn I normal summoned a hand trap, made Typhon, attacked, stopped them with hand traps again, next turn summoned another hand trap, made Moon, and won from there. It's like crazy how this deck can win as long as you can stop the Fire deck, because the Fire deck just invests more cards into their plays than you need to stop them. Like Diabel start discard 1, get Mourner, they've invested 2 cards out of their hand to try and play, and so like this deck trades very efficiently into those kind of decks. 1 SP for utility. The Necroquip is dead after you purge. Important to remember. The SP is dead after you purge, the Typhon is dead after you purge, and also the Caesar. Usually it's only here for going first, so it doesn't matter when you purge, but like going second, you have to be aware that if you break the board and you can't win immediately, you can't make Caesar. So we also played M7 as a rank 6 that works after we purge. The idea is you just make M7, you add back a hand trap, and then you can make Zeus on top of it. You can also make Zeus on top of Caesar if you ever want to. We also played a Gaia Charger, so we can make a 4 material Zeus whenever there's nothing in the graveyard we want to add back with M7. You can just make M7 or Caesar, attack, make Gaia, make Zeus, 4 material Zeus, really strong in the grind game. And then we played 1 Shangri-Ira. This is probably the one that would be the second sequence. The reason for this card is that it's really good against Tenpai. If you get shifted, you can just play with your Kashtira cards, make a Shangri-Ira, and it's actually really hard to out for them because it can't be destroyed by like Raigeki or Darkhole. And under shifter, they need to invest decent amount of resources and they probably will not be able to win the game. This card can also be very good in some grind games if you have Planet, because this triggers the Planet effect to pop. So if you can't quite clear their board, but you have Planet, you can like main phase 2 make Shangri-Ira. On their standby phase, it'll trigger, bring out a Fenrir, and trigger the pop of the Planet. So like there's some utility in here that you could sacrifice for a second sequence. The Shangri-Ira and the Gaia are the ones that came up the least for me. But it was all here for good reason, I think. So I'm not unhappy about the choices. All right, here's the side deck. A card that is actually not that good in this deck, but is here for a specific reason, is Fuvalos. Like I've said previously, for example, in the Centurion deck profile that I made from regionals, in these types of decks, you want to stop your opponent. And in those type of decks, usually this card is not great. But what I realized is that there's some decks in the format that are just very hard to stop. Snake Eye is not one of those decks, so I don't cite this card against Snake Eye. The decks I'm referring to are something like Ritual Beast or Yubel. Like those kind of decks are really hard to stop with just one-on-one hand traps, because like Phantom of Yubel is a crazy card, and some of the Ritual Beast combos play through Imper and Baylor Mourner like it's nothing. Against those types of decks, we wanted to have this card, right? You just have this thing that says like, okay, our hand traps trade very poorly into your plays, so if you try to play, you have to give us a lot of hand traps, right? So like we get like enough hand traps to actually stop Yubel under this card. Because this is only for specific matchups, I actually didn't cite it very often. Like I played against 2 Ritual Beasts and 1 Yubel. It is not for like the most expected decks in the format. Like it's not great against Tenpai and Snake Eyes in this deck. This card is crazy though. Purulia is in this deck even better because like against Snake Eyes, for example, because this deck plays over half hand traps, every time they commit to another play, you just like probably draw an answer to it anyways. It's actually phenomenal. As soon as you get just 1 draw out of this, you're back to your starting 5, and the more they push, the more they get punished. And then there is 1 Rysart in here. The idea behind this card is that in some matchups, I want to side out Earth and Unicorn, going second specifically. And this card helps you make the Fenrir a little bit better because it turns Fenrir into a 1-card Moon, because this thing only locks you if you special summon it, so you can't just normal it after Fenrir. The main reason for me was that when I went second and I wanted to keep Nibiru in for a matchup, I wanted to have the option to search search a normal summon with the Kashtira planet, so that I didn't have to normal summon a hand trap next to my Nibiru to turn it into Moon. I wanted to be able to go planet, Rise Heart, normal summon, make Moon, and go from there. It also helps you make Shangri-Ira against Tenpai. And then the beauty of this is that after you side the Charmies, and you already have all the hand traps in the world in the main deck, you don't actually need to side deck anything for going second. So you can focus your deck entirely on really, really broken cards for going first. So we decided to side deck 3 Strikes, 3 Judgments, and 3 D-Barriers. So basically what you do for any matchup is you take out the worst hand traps, because for most matchups there's like 1 or 2 hand traps that are suboptimal, right? Maybe Ogre isn't great in a matchup, or Bell, or Mourner, or Nibiru, those kind of hand traps. You usually keep Imperm, Veiler, Ash, Purge, that kind of stuff, of course, because they're really good against everything. But the other ones, you switch it around a little bit, and you just put in like cards that are good against everything, right? Strike and Judgment are really good against everything. Barrier is good against a lot of things, specifically here for Tenpai though, because Tenpai, sometimes if you don't have the Ash and Purge, which are really good against Tenpai, but there's some other hand traps in your deck that are not great, so Tenpai is like not the hardest matchup, I would say. Like, I think it's still favored. In our testing, it was definitely positive, but it can definitely need a little bit of help, and since they make you start, these cards are all phenomenal against Tenpai. But yeah, that's basically the idea, is just like you replace some hand traps or some really good interactions going first. So if I have like a Fenrir, a Strike, and some Fiendsmith stuff, and maybe 1 hand trap on top of it, it's like impossible for Snake Eye to have enough pushes unless they get really, really fortunate with their hand. And that's the deck, that's the idea, and I thought it was phenomenal. Once again, shout outs to the team for coming up with it together. We had a really good prep phase. We went back and forth on a lot of ideas that I might talk about at some point in the next couple days. I thought it was a really well thought out concept, and I'm happy we performed as well as we did. Kind of sad we didn't convert it into an actual win, but a lot of us topped, a lot of us did really well, and I'm very happy about that. Hope you guys enjoyed the little bit of an insight into the thought process behind the deck. If you did, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.